She thought that killing a deer would just be a hunting trip, but she had no idea that the animal was being monitored by a team of government researchers. The HOA had already tried to meddle in my life in various ways, but I had always managed to keep my farm out of their clutches. However, no matter how hard I tried to keep my distance, there was always someone willing to test my limits. And, of course, this time was no different. That morning, the day started quietly enough. I sipped my coffee on the veranda, watching the mist still dissipating over the pasture. The farm animals were waking up, and at the back of the property, a group of deer strolled among the trees, as they always did. This one in particular, a large male with impressive antlers, was almost a symbol of the place. I had seen him since he was young, and over time he became one of the specimens monitored by the region's wildlife conservation project. A GPS on his collar transmitted his location to researchers studying the habits of the local fauna. It was a magnificent animal, strong, imposing, and apparently doomed. The crack of a gunshot ripped through the silence of the camp. My heart raced. At the same moment, whatever I was holding fell to the ground. That wasn't normal. Yes, some people hunted in the area, but never on my property, and never without permission. I climbed into the truck and sped across the land, my heart hammering against my ribs. The sound came from near the area where the deer used to appear, and when I got there, the scene made my blood boil. She was there, standing next to the dead deer. A shotgun rested in her hands, and the smile on her face made it clear that she saw nothing wrong with what she had just done. The animal's body was lying in the dirt, blood still soaking the ground around it. It was a revolting scene. I got out of the truck so fast that the door almost came off with the force of the movement. The woman looked at me and smiled, as if she expected to be congratulated on her achievement. "Nice animal, huh?" she said, lightly tapping the deer's flank with the tip of her boot. "I was walking around your land. I thought you wouldn't mind." My jaw clenched. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" She rolled her eyes. "Oh, please. It's just a deer. They're everywhere." I took a deep breath so as not to lose control completely. Because it wasn't just a deer. It was a protected animal, part of an environmental study, tracked via GPS, and extremely valuable for wildlife research. And now a federal problem. The woman didn't notice my expression of pure hatred. Or, if she did, she ignored it. She continued talking, bragging about how she was a great shot, and how hunting was an underrated hobby for this spoiled new generation. Every word that came out of her mouth just made my blood boil even more. "You hunted an animal on my property without permission," I said, my voice low but full of anger. She laughed. "Oh, cut the crap. You have plenty of land. One less animal won't make any difference." I wanted to punch her back, but I held back, because while she was talking, while she was bragging, while she was kicking the animal's body like it was a cheap trophy, my brain was already plotting my revenge. The GPS attached to the deer's neck was still active. And do you know what that meant? That the location of the slaughtered animal had already been recorded. That the researchers monitoring its movements already knew something was wrong. And, even better, that someone was already coming to investigate. Did she want to have fun? Good, because the kind of fun that was about to happen was not going to be anything like what she had imagined. The woman was still there, standing next to the dead deer, bragging as if she had done something worthy of recognition. She talked about the thrill of hunting, about how incredible it was to hit a clean shot, and about how I should be grateful, because now I had one less problem on my farm. The problem was that she had no idea that the real trouble was yet to begin. I kept looking at the scene, trying to contain the urge to rip the rifle out of her hand and throw it into the bushes. But instead, I simply took a deep breath, because I knew what was about to happen. The GPS. That deer wasn't just any animal. It was part of a government-funded wildlife research program, monitored 24 hours a day by a team of scientists who spent months analyzing the migratory patterns of the region's deer. And this monitoring meant that the GPS attached to his neck had already sent out an alert. Yes, an alert. The animal's death had been automatically registered in the system as soon as it stopped moving. And that meant that, at that very moment, someone was already on their way to see what had happened. The woman continued to stand there, completely ignoring my face of silent fury, cleaning her shotgun as if she were in a hunting magazine commercial. I didn't say another word. I just picked up my cell phone and looked at the screen. GPS active. The deer's location registered, and a detail that made me smile internally. The last location recorded before the kill was right on my property. This meant that her legal problem was going to be much bigger than a simple illegal cull. She had trespassed. She had hunted without permission. And she had shot a protected animal. The perfect combo to turn a simple hunting trip into a legal inferno. I looked down the dirt road that led to my farm. The sound of an approaching engine caught my attention. Ah, this was going to be good. The white car stopped near the entrance, and a man got out. It was one of the biologists from the tracking program, someone I'd met a few times when they came to check the deer data. His name was Thomas, a quiet, soft-spoken guy who took his job seriously. He didn't need more than 5 seconds to see the body of the deer on the ground and put the pieces together. The woman looked at him with a confused expression, not understanding what was going on. "Who are you?" she asked, frowning, as if a biologist was beneath her dignity to answer. Thomas didn't look at her. He bent down beside the deer, analyzing the tracking collar, took a small tablet out of his backpack, and started checking the data. I stayed silent, watching. It was only when he looked up at me that he spoke. "The GPS stopped transmitting 15 minutes ago. That was the end point of the route." I nodded, crossing my arms. It was her, and I pointed at the woman, who, for the first time, seemed to understand that this wasn't just a trivial situation. "What?" I said, laughing nervously. "Wait, what's going on here?" Thomas stood up and wiped his hands on his pants. There wasn't a shred of patience in his eyes. "Do you have any idea what you've just done? This deer was being monitored as part of a wildlife migration study. It was one of the most important specimens in the program." The woman rolled her eyes. "Oh, give me a break. It was just one deer. There are thousands out there." "Not that one." Thomas's voice was firm. "This animal was registered as an environmental asset. It had a government-funded GPS tracker, was part of a conservation project, and was protected by state and federal laws." The color began to fade from her face. "Wait a minute, is this serious?" I held back a smile. Thomas continued, picking up his cell phone and starting to dial a number. "It's extremely serious. This is considered illegal hunting of a protected animal, as well as trespassing. If proven, you could face federal prosecution." The woman finally seemed to understand the size of the mess she had gotten herself into. Federal prosecution? Now she was starting to sweat. Thomas spoke quickly into the phone, explaining the situation to someone on the other end of the line. From the tone of his voice and the words he used, it was clear that this wasn't just going to be a fine or a warning. It was going to escalate. The woman began to take slow steps backwards, as if she was considering the possibility of simply getting out of there before things got any worse. But it was too late for that. The deer's GPS had done its job. The records were in the system. And now, it wasn't just us who knew what had happened. The government knew too. The fun was just beginning. The woman was still there, but now without that arrogant smile on her face. The tone of debauchery was completely gone. For the first time, it seemed that she was beginning to understand the extent of the shit she had gotten herself into. Thomas ended his call, put his cell phone back in his pocket, and crossed his arms. The serious look on his face already made it clear that this wasn't going to end with a simple lecture. "They're on their way," he said. She, who until seconds ago had been trying to pretend it was nothing, turned to me, her hands gesturing desperately. "This is an exaggeration. I didn't know the damn thing was protected or whatever. It was an accident." I laughed, a short, dry laugh. "Accident? You brought a shotgun? Broke into my farm and deliberately shot it. That's no accident. That's stupid." She opened her mouth to retort, but closed it again. Her brain seemed to be spinning 1,000 times trying to find a way out. But there was no way out. Not when the government already knew what had happened. It didn't take half an hour for the dust on the road to announce the arrival of the authorities. First came a state police car, then a truck from the Department of Wildlife. When the vehicles stopped and the doors opened, the woman went even paler. The first to leave was a policeman, a sturdy guy with sunglasses and a closed expression, the typical type who has no patience for lame excuses. Behind him was an environmental enforcement officer wearing a vest and holding a clipboard with papers that, from the look on his face, I knew were notices waiting to be filled in. The officer took a quick look around before turning to Thomas. "You're the ones who called it in?" Thomas nodded and pointed to the deer on the ground. "One of our tracking specimens was shot illegally. It was being monitored by GPS. The lady here was the one who shot it." The policeman's eyes immediately turned to the woman. He scanned the scene. The dead deer, the gun still in her hand, the traces of blood on the ground. The clipboard the other officer was holding was already being filled in. "Full name?" asked the inspector, without even looking at her. The woman blinked, hesitated, looked around as if searching for an invisible escape route. You see, I had no idea this was illegal. I thought it was some deer." The policeman took off his sunglasses, revealing the eyes of someone who has heard this excuse more times than he can count. "So, you think it's acceptable to go around shooting any animal you see?" She opened her mouth, but couldn't answer. The inspector flipped through some papers, made a few notes, and then looked up. This animal was one of the priority specimens in the wildlife migration program. Slaughtering a tracked animal without authorization can result in a fine of up to $50,000 and possible jail time. Her face contorted in sheer panic. $50,000? The inspector continued, as if he hadn't heard her squeal. "In addition, there is also the issue of trespassing and illegal hunting without a license. We need to check that you have a valid hunting license for this state." The policeman shook his head, reaching for the handcuff on his belt. "License or not, she shot on someone else's private property. That alone is enough to arrest her right now." She took a step back, raising her hands. "Wait, it doesn't have to go that far. I can pay the fine. I can sort it out another way." The inspector frowned. "The animal's GPS indicates that it was slaughtered less than 15 minutes before the full stop alert. This means that the slaughter took place recently, and you were still here when we arrived. This case is already registered in the system as an environmental crime. You can't just pay up and walk away." She was speechless, literally at a loss. The policeman approached and did what I had expected from the start. He turned the woman onto her back and attached the handcuffs to her wrists. "You have the right to remain silent," he began, as she finally realized that this wasn't a nightmare, but reality knocking on the door with full force. I just stood there with my arms folded, watching everything with the most satisfied expression in the world. She tried to struggle. She tried to argue. She even tried to blame me, but to no avail. When the policeman pushed her lightly into the car, her gaze met mine, and it was the first time I saw her without arrogance, without superiority, just fear. The car door was slammed shut. The inspector made some more notes, took some photos of the deer, and then looked at me. "Do you want to press charges for trespassing?" I wanted to say yes. I wanted her to answer for every step she took on my land without permission. But honestly, the shit she'd already gotten herself into was enough. "I think the fine and imprisonment are enough." The inspector nodded and put the papers in his briefcase. "We'll remove the animal for analysis and send it to the laboratory. The body will be used for studies by the tracking team." He handed me a document, something confirming that I had no involvement in the slaughter, and that my property was being registered as a crime scene for procedural purposes only. I signed it without hesitation. The inspection truck collected the deer, while the police car disappeared down the dirt road, taking my neighbor straight to a destination she never imagined when she woke up that morning. My farm was finally back to its usual silence, but I knew that her story was far from over. My farm returned to silence the moment the Department of Wildlife truck disappeared down the road, and the police car took my neighbor straight into a legal nightmare she never imagined. But even then, I knew the story wasn't over. The whole thing spread through the neighborhood faster than fire through dry straw. It didn't take a day for everyone in the neighborhood to know that the woman had been arrested for poaching, trespassing, and killing a protected animal. Some people were shocked, others pretended they didn't know the criminal, and her handlers in the HOA tried to minimize the situation. But how do you hide something when the local papers are covering it? Yes, it was on the news. The next day, I turned on the TV, and there she was, on the cover of the local channel's website, with a photo taken directly from the police database. The headline was practically a poem. Woman arrested for poaching on private property. Deer tracked by government was shot. I sipped my coffee with the greatest satisfaction in the world. Watching the report, in which they explained how a specimen of high environmental value had been killed without any justification. Scientists from the Conservation Project were interviewed and were outraged, saying that this particular deer was one of the most studied and monitored in the region. And best of all, the woman who always thought she was the queen of the neighborhood, who loved to make rules and judge everyone, was now being painted as an environmental criminal for the whole state to see. The HOA tried to fight back. The members of the association released an official statement saying that the situation was a misunderstanding and that they trusted that justice would be done. But no one took the association seriously anymore after what happened. In fact, the HOA itself began to crumble when some people realized that they were spending money supporting an organization led by someone who could very well end up in jail. And that was just the beginning of her hell. The woman managed to get out of jail on bail the next day, but she was far from free. The charges against her were serious. The Wildlife Department wasn't going to let up, and I was sure that the prosecutor in the case would want to make an example of her. The $50,000 fine for the illegal killing of the deer was just the first blow. But when investigators started digging deeper, they discovered that she didn't have a valid hunting license in the state either. And here came another fine, another $15,000. Oh, and of course, there was the trespassing. Her lawyer tried to argue that she didn't know she was on private property, but that didn't stick. After all, there were fences and signs around the entire farm. So, another lawsuit. In total, she was dealing with almost $100,000 in fines and legal fees. And guess what? She didn't have that kind of money. Rumors began to spread from house to house. The woman who was always in charge of the HOA, who was always criticizing everyone and who thought she was above the rules, was now sunk in debt and scandal. Some people started calling for her removal from office. Others simply pretended they had never met her. And then came the final bombshell. She had to sell her house. That's right. After years of being the boss of the neighborhood, after fining people for ugly fences and mailboxes in the wrong color, after making life hell for her neighbors, she had to put her house up for sale because she couldn't afford the fines and the lawyers. She tried to resist. She tried to hold on to the property as long as she could. But the interest on the fines began to accumulate, and the courts didn't want to hear any excuses. The bank came knocking. I watched from the sidelines as the glorious "For Sale" sign was put up in her garden. And do you want to know the icing on the cake? Nobody in the neighborhood wanted to buy. People avoided her house as if it were cursed. Some even made jokes saying that the spirit of the deer haunted the property. Time passed, and the house became empty, the garden became shabby, the windows began to gather dust. And one day, finally, she left. There were no goodbyes, no commotion. She simply disappeared, like a bad nightmare coming to an end. Well, my farm went back to being what it had always been, a quiet space, without idiots trying to turn it into a private playground. The Wildlife Project continued, and the research team brought in a new deer to replace the one that was lost. This time, we stepped up security and installed new signs warning that hunting there was strictly forbidden. But, to be honest, Nobody else dared to even think about doing anything like that after what happened. The HOA? Well, without its dictator at the helm, the association lost steam. Shortly afterwards, the residents themselves decided to officially dissolve it. For the first time in years, people could do what they wanted with their properties without fear of ridiculous fines or arbitrary rules. And me, I carried on exactly as I always had, watching, waiting, and ready to react if any more idiots tried to challenge me. Because if this story has taught me anything, it's that, on my farm, anyone who plays with fire always gets burned. And if you like this video, don't forget to leave a comment and a like.